Ladies and gentlemen, can I please have your attention? I've just been handed an urgent and horrifying news story, and I need all of you to stop what you're doing and listen.
I am that dude, Bodkins.
Yeah, DP lost it, Steve. Yeah.
Right. Where he's wondering, he's like, I
Patty to patty.
He won style, like no weight classes.
Yeah, basically, like I said, there's been a couple guys that are like,
It's ridiculous. No way. There's nobody else out there. He's your guy.
That's just not my mentality, bro.
Yeah. Leave the ladder down. That's my always like, hey, somebody helped you out. Why not help somebody else out? Return.
Give a big round of applause for the one and only Bodkins Show.
Or bringing Craig Counsell down the interstate in a move unexpected. I had people.
I'm going to repeat that again, folks. I didn't stutter. Welcome to the Bodkins Show.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another great episode of the Bodkins Show. I am your host, Bodkins, of course. Oh man, it is. We usually do these Sunday night shows. We've been doing the NFL recap, and then longtime listeners, fans of the shows know we usually take about a 2-week hiatus break, and then Sunday nights be kind of a sit down, intimate, one-on-one interview style. And we are kicking off that tonight, our season, maybe season 3, I guess you could say, of these type of one-on-one interviews. They're actually kind of my favorite thing to do. I try to bring on guests I've never really interacted with before or talked to, and just learn about them, whatever it may be, life, sports, how we do. So before I bring on guests, and I do want to shout out a guy who's been on the pod several different times. My guy Ray Hayes, first round submission last night, and is now 6-1 as a professional. So we want to shout out Ray. He's been on 2 or 3 different times, and the guy he beat last night is a guy who has fought in the PFL. So Ray is hopefully making his way into either the PFL or UFC or someplace, a major organization soon. It seems like that's the plan, just from reading from the tea leaves. I haven't really spoke out to him, just did tell him congratulations, on the big win last night. Saw him going through the weight cut on his, Snapchat and Instagram, good friends with his head coach as well. So saw and all that, congratulations to that whole team and everything that they're accomplishing. But for Ray to be 6-1 as a pro and making his ranks, so we want to shout that out to Ray, Sweet Baby Hayes, always representing, always takes the time out to, anytime I've reached out to have him come on the pod to talk about, he's come on. So shout out to Ray and all the success that he is enduring right now, and, being great. So speaking of great, one of the things that I've been accustomed to and things that we talk about on this podcast, and a couple of things that I've won a few in my life, and that is none other than these fantasy championship belts, baby. I'm a little bit, everybody knows I love to talk fantasy, I love to talk a little shit, but a guy who has taken a deep dive into fantasy sports, fantasy football, is joining us today. A guy who wrote a book. This is the very first time, first time, I guess you could say, I've had an author on the podcast. He wrote The History of Fantasy Sports. You can find the link to that in the description of the show here. Give it up for Mr. Larry Schechter, baby. Larry, Thank you for joining me this evening. Thank you for starting out. Let's start out. Were you interested in fantasy football or fantasy sports, and that's what started this path of writing this book?
Well, I've played fantasy sports for more than 30 years, and for a long time, I look around at the industry and the landscape, and I kind of wonder, how did this all happen? Because some people had ideas for games years ago, and it started out very slow. No one knew what fantasy was, and it's evolved into this multi-billion-dollar worldwide industry. There's millions and millions of people playing everything from fantasy football, fantasy baseball, to fantasy wakeboarding, fantasy Iditarod, cricket, all over the world. You got news services, stat services, podcasts, fantasy experts. You turn on an NFL game or any pro game now, you see fantasy stats. So I wondered for a long time, how did this all happen? Because nobody has ever written a book like this. Nobody's ever explained this or researched it. You can find bits and pieces here and there if you look it up, but nobody has written anything comprehensive. So I just thought somebody needs to do this. And I started it actually 2.5 years ago. And I thought it was something I could knock out in a few months. I was completely wrong. It took 18 months, full-time work, researching, interviewing dozens and dozens of people, and writing.
I want to get into the book itself here in just a minute, but like I got so many questions now. Like, what were you doing prior to that? So like, did you have to like quit your job to like you said, it's full time? Just like, and it doesn't sound like you like grew up wanting to be an author.
Well,
like this was.
I was retired.
Okay.
I was happily retired, and I actually this has made me unretired because like I said, it was 18 months. And then once I had the book finished, I've been working pretty much full time for another year, getting it published and promoting it, because I need to let people know about this book, or else nobody else will.
So, I mean, so it's like most people take up golfing, take up, fishing. You're like, you know what? I'm going this thing that I mean, but you said you've been playing fantasy for 30 years. So this thing that I love, I'm going to dig deeper into it, more of like how it became. It's like, that's what you wanted to do.
Well, I just thought, I just thought it really was needed. And I did it as a contribution to the fantasy sports community. And yeah, I've been retired for a while, and I play fantasy sports and I play golf. And I met a friend of mine when I met him several years ago, and I told him about, he's like, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I play golf, I play fantasy sports." He said, "Those are the two most time-consuming hobbies I know of. How do you do both?" Yes, well, I'm retired. Other than that, I'm retired. So, but yeah. I had to give up. I actually had to give up a lot of golf for the last 2.5 years because of the book. I've given up a lot of golf, and I gave up some fantasy sports too. I didn't play season-long fantasy football last year for the first time, which really kind of sucked. But
yeah. So were you just playing daily games at that point in time, or just?
I had never played daily before. I played some daily fantasy football this year for the first time I ever played daily.
So, like, before you started writing the book, had you ever wrote anything before? Like, like just even like, I guess, like, I mean, I'm sure everybody writes like college essays and things like that, but anything like long form?
I actually did. I'm known as one of the better fantasy baseball players. I'm in the 2 fantasy baseball experts leagues, the USA Today sponsored Labor and Tout Wars. I've been in those for like 20 years or so. And 2014, I wrote a book called Winning Fantasy Baseball with all my strategies. So that was my first book, and this is my second book.
Okay, so
completely
book,
different.
Yeah, it's completely. You're writing more. The 2014, I'm sure. Like, how did that book? You just writing more about like what you do to win.
Yeah, that was about my my strategy for fantasy baseball. How to everything from beginning to end to play fantasy baseball. And a lot of the strategy applies to other fantasy sports also. But, that was about me, my strategy in fantasy baseball. Whereas this book, The History of Fantasy Sports, it's completely different. It's not about me or my opinions. It's not about really how to play fantasy sports or strategy. It's about the stories of the people that created this whole industry and how it all happened.
What drew you into like fantasy sports? Like I kind of find I played, like, I remember dabbling when I was like in high school a little bit, like with my couple of my basketball coaches, and we didn't really take it that serious. And that was like 2005, and I felt like at that time that wasn't like what, obviously nowhere near what it is today, right? but like what led you into like fantasy? It sounds like fantasy baseball first, and then into the other sports.
I just happened to hear an ad on the radio for a company that was offering fantasy baseball, and it sounded really interesting. So I inquired and, immediately wanted to do it. And from there, I started playing fantasy football as well. Most people hear about it from a friend or coworker or relative, but, my story was, a little bit different.
Yep. Baseball first love?
As a fan, yeah. Yeah.
Is that still the number one, your favorite fantasy sport to play?
Well, no, I like fantasy. I like fantasy football also. I like both fantasy baseball and fantasy football the most.
Okay, but
yeah, I played fantasy basketball for a while, but I haven't done it in a long time.
I can't get into bet. Like I love like watching the games. Baseball. I'm a big diehard Cubs fan, through and through. But like I can't fantasy baseball. I don't know what it is. It's just like my brain's like, I love football, right? It's the one day I can get on there, check everything. The Thursday thing. Baseball, I just feel like it's so much continuously.
Yeah, it's a long grind. 160 games.
What do you recommend for somebody like myself? I love fantasy football, but like, how do you to get into fantasy baseball?
What was that? I missed part of that.
What would you say to somebody like myself? Like, I want to kind of play, but it's just because of the long grind. What should I do, or how should I get into fantasy baseball?
Well, if you want to play fantasy baseball, because it is a long grind, I would say don't get into a league that you can make moves every day. Be in a league where you only make moves weekly. Because that's plenty as it is. I've never done daily moves. I never would. It would be way too much.
So while we're on the topic in baseball, is just starting. Like, you're obviously getting ready to play this year fantasy baseball? The book hasn't taken up time for this year for baseball.
Yeah, no, I'm playing. I'm going to play fantasy baseball this year. In fact, I got the Labor League is going to be next Friday night. This coming Friday night. Yeah.
So who are like the top kind of guys that you're looking at in baseball? Or how does baseball even evaluate, like, say, like in fantasy side?
The top guys in baseball?
Yeah.
For this year?
Yeah.
Well, Shohei Ohtani, and there's a handful of them. Bobby Witt Jr.
Are you looking for guys that hit home runs, or like get on base, or like what do you like? What's the key? Like, so for like football, like, well, we want a usage guy. You know what I mean? A guy that's going to be, for like running back. Like, I'm like, you know what I mean? They're not. I want the guy that's going to get the most carries, or receivers. Hey, this is the guy that's going to get the funnel of the targets, right? Like, what do we look for inside of baseball?
Well, it depends on the scoring system for your league, but typically the categories are like batting average, home runs, RBIs, runs scored, stolen bases. So you're looking, for hitters, obviously. So you're looking for good combinations of all that. Like a guy like Shohei Ohtani has a high batting average, a lot of he has all those things. He has lots of home runs, stolen bases, RBIs, runs. So he's like the best hitter for fantasy purposes, pretty much.
So what about, is a hitter more important than pitcher?
No, they're equal. In most, it depends on the league scoring system, but usually they're equal. You have 4 or 5 hitting categories and 4 or 5 pitching categories.
So that's why Ohtani obviously number one, because he can pitch and hit and do a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
I got you. Any what do you look for, like in a sleeper in baseball?
Well, there's really not too much in the way of sleepers anymore, because there's so much information out there. It's like, getting to my book about the history. It used to be, when fantasy sports started, there was no information. There was no internet. There were no news services. So information was a premium. Like, there's a guy named Lenny Melnick, who's fairly well known in the fantasy industry. when he started playing, he and his partner would go to the local newsstand every Sunday and get out of town Sunday newspapers from everywhere they could get. They get it. They take out the sports section, throw out the rest of it, and read the whole sports section to get little tidbits about the local sports teams. And one of the first fantasy football leagues in Florida, one of the guys subscribed to 28 newspapers. Every out of town, every NFL team, you subscribe to a newspaper in order to get the information. So guys like that had a big edge on their competition because they knew information that nobody else knew if they weren't doing the same thing, which most people weren't. But now it's completely different. Now you can go on Roto World, Roto Wire, ESPN, every news service, and you can get
Fantasy
all the
Pros. Yeah. There's 1,000 of them.
Exactly. Yeah, who's hurt, or who's getting called up from AAA, and
So when you were doing this research for the book, how did this thing kind of come about? Like the thing that we kind of love and play gamble on, bet on, and you could spend hours, watching people do their punishments and things like that. How did this all begin? Because we know how leagues start now, right? So you get a couple of friends, couple of work buddies, and a league starts. But how did the first league happen, and then how does it become so big?
Well, my book starts out with precursors to fantasy sports like APA and Stratomatic and tabletop games. And then it gets into, how fantasy football was invented and spread, the invention and spread of fantasy baseball, then commercial games, publications, radio shows, news services, stat services, right through legal issues and worldwide expansion. It covers the whole thing. And one of the that championship belt you held up before, was that from Trophy Smack?
Yeah, it was sent to me. I believe Fantasy Belts or somebody. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, there's one of the chapters in the book is about innovative things that people have done, like mock drafting and injury experts and fantasy insurance and things like this. And the Trophy Smack is the big company that does belts and things like that. They're in there. And so to kind of go back to your question, though, the first fantasy football league was in 1963. A guy named Bill Winkenbach, actually, before that, he had kind of primitive games for fantasy golf and fantasy baseball in the mid to late 50s. And he told a couple of friends about this, and they're like, hey, we should do this for football. So they started a football league, the first fantasy football league in 63. And Winkenbach was a part owner of the Oakland Raiders, 10% owner. And so right from the beginning, you had things that are common now in fantasy. You would have these guys who were affiliated with the Raiders in the stands, sometimes rooting for players that were playing against the Raiders. And the people around them were looking at them like, what in the hell are you doing rooting against the Raiders? And the other thing you mentioned about something about watching the loser's punishment.
Yeah.
The concept of a loser's punishment goes back to that very first ever league. The very first ever league, Bill Winkenbach made a dunce trophy that the last place person had to display in their house for the year until they could pass it off to next year's loser. And since you got a Green Bay shirt on, I'll tell you, one of the members of the original Fantasy Football League in '63 was Ron Wolf.
Oh yeah, became general manager of the Packers.
Right.
Brett Favre's, is the reason Brett Favre came to Green Bay. Reggie White and so forth.
Yep. He was in that first league.
Oh wow! And then fantasy football to real football.
Right. And fantasy baseball is a different story. Like Dan Okrent is the guy who's credited with inventing fantasy baseball. But there's a myth out there that he magically came up with the idea on a plane flight from Connecticut to Texas. And that myth is not true at all. It's a whole lot more to the story. It goes back 20 years before that. But he came up with it, and there were lots of people playing like kind of primitive versions of fantasy baseball before Oakrent came along. But what he created was like kind of like checkers compared to everybody else's chess. He created chess compared to other people's checkers. And the other thing is he was in the media, and the people he got into his first league were in the media, so they got a lot of exposure, which nobody else had ever gotten. Like, some people were playing like primitive games just with their friends, but nobody knew about it. But Oakrent, because they were in the media, they got like on the Today Show, and there was an article written in the New York Times. So it started to spread because of that.
Obviously, or do you think we're in the like fantasy boom right now because of like the age of the internet, and it's in sports books and things like that are opening it up?
Yeah, well, it's developed right along through the years, and when computers came along, that really helped. And then when the internet came along, it exploded because of the internet. And then there was a change. There was like some legislation about 10 years ago that made daily fantasy sports possible. So daily fantasy has helped it all explode.
Back in like in the 60s, like when you're in the football, even like in baseball, and I didn't ask this, but which one was first? And then kind of like how the hell did the scoring come up?
You mean
like how did they score back then? Yeah,
right, okay,
like,
right, well, right, okay. So
generation of computer just
yeah.
added.
So what would happen, is the commissioner of the league or somebody in the league, usually the commissioner, would have to do all the statistics by hand. So if you're in a football league, let's say I'm the commissioner of a football league, everybody's got to call me by noon on Sunday with their moves. Then I got to manually make all the changes, and then I got to get the statistics out of the newspaper and do everything by hand. So it took the commissioner hours and hours every week for whatever sport you're playing. And when computers came along, that made it possible to do everything a lot more easily, obviously. And when I began the book, when I first started researching, my idea was I'm going to write the history of fantasy sports. How did it all happen? Who did what when? And when I started researching and talking to people, I started hearing things that were really, really interesting. A lot of fascinating stories. Some were inspirational, a lot of funny stuff. And so I realized early on, if I could just write the history of fantasy sports and it'll get the job done, it'll also come off as a very boring research paper. But by telling the stories that I was hearing, it'll get the job done, and it'll make it really interesting and easy to read instead of boring. And that's what's happened. The reviews have been fantastic. People say it's easy to read, fascinating. People have been playing fantasy sports for years, or even in the industry for years, don't even know most of this stuff. And like give you an example, that when computers came around, one of the first statistic services was run by a couple in Pennsylvania, Jim and Gloria Berger. They did basketball and baseball. And what you had to do then for baseball was the USA Today published the American League statistics for the week on Tuesday and the National League statistics on Wednesday. So Gloria would read the statistics, Jim would put it in the computer, they'd print out the reports, mail them to their clients on Wednesday night. So one Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with their first child, and they did not let that stop them. So in between contractions, she would read the statistics to Jim, and he'd put them in the computer. And then she'd be like, oh, wait, hold on. Here comes another one. Hold on. Oh, okay, it passed. And she continued. And they got their reports out on time Wednesday night, and their daughter, who was born that day, 37 years later, she now plays in a fantasy football league with her dad.
Well, I hope so. She was ingrained to it.
Yeah.
It's wild. That's a lot of trust. Like, I don't know if I would trust my commissioner in today's game, if I'm faxing in my lineup or I'm calling over the phone, be like, hey, this is the moves I'm making, and trust him enough to get the statistics right, because to me, if he's winning, I'm thinking that he's cheating.
Yeah. Right. Well, I know. I'm sure some people were like, double checking the statistics. But that's a good point, though. You got to trust them.
Yeah. How do you think, like from that first game from the '60s, and even like the baseball, from I often think about this about a lot of things, right? But in life, but like, how did it go from like, okay, this how did it go from like these 2 or 3 people playing in this game to the next group, just word of mouth, and then like they started a new league?
Well, in football, what happened that Winkenbach and the original people kind of mostly kept it to themselves. And you had to be somewhat affiliated with the Oakland Raiders to be involved. But one of the original members was a guy named Andy Musolimus, and he owned a bar in Oakland. And after the first year or two, he decided it would be a good idea to make fantasy football available to his patrons at his bar. He thought it'd be fun, good for business. So he did, and they started a fantasy football league at his bar. And then people would come into the bar and see what was going on and be like, what is this? And they'd explain it to him. So it started to spread. And, he soon had a second league and a third league, and then a women's only league, because the guys didn't want to play with women in their league. And then, people would come in from out of town and see it. And it really spread a lot, where after a few years, Musolimus had people calling his bar from like all over the country saying, hey, I heard about this fantasy football thing. How do the rules work? So that helped a lot. Just word of mouth. Then later there was an article published in, I think it was Inside Sport magazine, where a lot of people saw that article and started playing. And the Rust History guys, Dan Okra, Bantam Books had them publish a book in 1984 about rotisserie baseball. And thousands of people read that book and started their own leagues. Because some of the well-known people in fantasy first started by that book in 1984, like Matthew Berry. Matthew Berry is probably the most well-known fantasy expert person in the world, pretty much. He was like 14 years old when that book came out in 1984, and he started playing. And another really well-known guy, Ron Chandler, same thing. He saw that book in '84. In fact, he's got it in, like, I think he got it like in the summer. So he was going to have to wait till the spring to start a fantasy baseball league, but he loved the idea and he didn't want to wait till the spring. So he got some friends and they started fantasy hockey. They just kind of, made up their own rules based on, the ideas they saw about fantasy baseball.
When you were doing research for the book, was it hard to reach out to some of these people? Like, did you meet them in person, over the phone, or how did that work?
Mostly by Zoom. I would do a Zoom interview and record it so that afterwards I could play back and, write down whatever I needed to write down.
Was there anybody that you wanted to interview or talk to that you just didn't get a chance to, or was everybody pretty much like open to telling this, helping you out here?
For the most part, I got most of the people I wanted to talk to. I track them down somehow on, I know some people in the industry, and then some people know other people, and I track people down on Facebook and LinkedIn and other ways. And I got to a lot of people. But a few of them I couldn't get, like Andy Musolimus, for example. He passed away several years ago. But I also just, I did massive research, just Googled article after article after article. And speaking of Musolimus, I had read probably 20 articles about Winkenbach and Musolimus, where I'm reading the same information over and over again, but every so often there's like one little thing that hadn't been mentioned before. So I'm on about like the 20th or 25th article about Musolimus, and I see something that had never been mentioned before. which was amazing that it hadn't been mentioned before. Mussolinius, when he was 17 years old, Pearl Harbor happened, and he enlisted, and he volunteered for a unit where the recruiter said, "You're going to go behind enemy lines. 97% of you are not going to return alive," and he volunteered anyway. So the guy was a war hero. It's like spreading fantasy football was like the least important thing, not the most important thing he did in his life. He was a war hero, and the mission he was on was actually kept secret for many years. And finally, after years and years, they made it public and flew him to Washington to get a Congressional Medal of Honor or something like that.
Wow. So the guy who is kind of, I guess maybe I don't want to say the spreader or the help spread fantasy football is the war hero and received Congressional Medal of Honor all at the same time.
Right. Yeah. And he like most of the other people in his unit. Well, a lot of them, died in Germany, and well, actually they were in Greece, actually, but they died in the war, and then others, had already passed away by the time Congress made it public. That a lot of them had already died of natural causes. Another thing that was cool about Mussolinius, he was known. I just read one article. Just happened to mention this. He was known as one of the first Oakland bartenders that welcomed black people, which kind of tells you what a guy he was.
Yeah, open to all.
Yeah.
So it sounds good. Yeah. I'm sure then they're playing fantasy football too. At the same time. It's a game for it is literally the game for everybody. Let me ask you your like process when you begin to like write this, but what's your like how do your process? Like every author or musician has like a process of like what they're gonna do, like because you did a lot of research, so it's like, hey, today I'm just gonna break down like this and do all this, or how do you go about that?
Well, I went about it kind of like topic by topic. I just would choose a topic and say, okay, I'm gonna look into this, and then a lot of times when I found something out, it would send me down 4 more rabbit holes.
You just go down the rabbit hole, take notes, and then come back, or how does that work out?
Yeah, just keep researching, or I find more people I need to talk to, and I mean I could have done it for 3 years instead of 18 months, but I had to kind of cut it off at some point. The book is like 300 pages. I could have written 600, but that wouldn't have been practical.
Is there going to be are you going to look onto like another book, like or is that like the next project, or?
No, this is it.
This is
I'm going to be promoting this for a long time. This is my contribution to the fantasy sports community. And people who have never played fantasy sports have really liked the book too, because it's about the stories, not about fantasy sports or strategy. And so everyone listening to this, I need your support. I need to get the book. Tell people that play fantasy sports about the book. You'll all love it.
Again, the link to the book is in the description of this show. So there's a link to the Amazon link that you shared with me, Larry. So hopefully, we'll help you out and as well. It's on it's in the description of this show, and it's on Amazon. The history of fantasy sports. So.
Well, it's on most booksellers have it on their websites, paperback and ebook. Amazon is where you can get like all the details and lots of reviews.
Yeah. Now, thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. He said, "Awesome interview. Appreciate it." Now I lost my train of thought where we were going there with. Is there somebody that, Larry, that is like kind of like, and maybe you said it earlier, that is kind of like they consider like the founder or the godfather? I know you mentioned the multiple people in Oakland, but is there somebody that's like kind of like, hey, this is the founder of fantasy sports?
No, not really. I mean, Winkenbach kind of invented fantasy football, and Mussolini spread it, and as I said, Okren created like the best version of rotisserie baseball. It was called rotisserie baseball before fantasy baseball. And then other people did other things. Like my book is full of entrepreneurs who really created the industry. Because what would happen is they would see a need for something that doesn't exist. Like, for example, Ian Allen and Bruce Taylor were college students at the University of Washington, and they somehow heard about fantasy football and played it, and they loved it. And they said, well, this is great, but there's no information available. Let's start a magazine. And they started a magazine. It was actually a college project. They started a magazine as a college project. And it became Fantasy Football Index, which became one of the largest fantasy football magazines, and it's still going today.
Yeah.
And then other people they'd see a need for a book or stat service or news service, and people created things that turned into like RotoWire and Roto World and just everything we have now.
I heard you say you didn't play long season this year football. Are you gonna get back into it this year?
Yeah, I will.
Are you a dynasty person, or are you just like like a season, or what's your favorite type of format?
I've never done dynasty. I mean, lots of people love dynasty, so it's just my personal preference. For me, I just want to start over every year with an equal chance. I don't want to have to go through a rebuilding year. But a lot of people like dynasty, so I'm not saying it's bad. It's same thing like what was it? Yeah, like before I was saying like I would never play a season-long fantasy baseball that had daily moves.
Yeah,
because it's too much. But some people like it, So if you like it, fine. Just it's supposed to, fantasy's supposed to be fun.
Amen.
And it is fun. One thing that emerged during my research that I had no idea this was going to happen when I started the book. That one of the biggest themes throughout the book is how fantasy brings people together. Co-workers, high school and college friends have some stayed together for years and years because they had a fantasy league, parents and children. It really just brings people together like crazy. There's a fantasy football draft in Vegas where you've got the CEO of a Fortune 500 company sitting next to a plumber, and they're talking like they're best buddies. And one of the guys I interviewed in the book, Mark Mariani, he was with CBS Sports and Turner Sports, and he told me when he got his first job in the sports industry, he had never heard about fantasy sports, but his office had a football league, so they're telling about this fantasy football league, asking him if he wants to play. He said he figured out after they told him about it, it's like, wait a minute, if I join this league, I can pick up the phone and call my boss's 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 boss in the fancy office in Manhattan, and this guy will take my call to talk about a trade or whatever. Whereas ordinarily this guy wouldn't take my call in a million years. So he joined.
Hey, that's true. I mean, it does keep everybody together. Like you said, like lifelong friends or different aspects. I look at my own league and we got different characters from all over, different backgrounds or different jobs where it's like the one thing that we can do. My favorite thing to do is like, really in fantasy is like, I compare it to like pro wrestling. So like, I love to do, like cut promos on all my opponents, like I'm the champion or whatever. It's one of my favorite things to do in my league. They probably get tired of it, but I definitely cut a good promo, for against all my opponents. We had a question in the comments. Do you prefer standard or PPR football?
I prefer PPR.
Yeah, I think that's the way the world are. And are you like this? It seems like more now. It's just like, how can we score more? Like, are you like the super flex, or you like the old standard way of just one quarterback, or what? If I was say, Larry, create a fantasy league, how would you set up the fantasy league?
I don't know. I mean, I've never been in a league with a super flex. I've been in pretty standard leagues. It's not, it's not because I don't think the other ones are any good. It's just I've happened to be in ones that are pretty standard, and I'm not in like a million leagues. So
You're not, how many leagues?
If I had time, typically about maybe 5 baseball and 5 football.
Okay, yeah, that's about me. I can't do, and that's too much almost. This year I was like, I can't handle it. I gotta have. Last year I was in a bunch of leagues on a bunch of different apps, and I was like, I can't do this. I said, I toned it down to just the sleeper app, and I said, if you ain't not playing on sleeper app, don't ask me to play.
Yeah, but some people play in lots and lots of leagues. But if I had time to be in like dozens and dozens of leagues, I'd do different formats. There's lots of things that would be good.
All right. What's the? I got a couple more questions before we get out of here, real quick, Larry. What's the most? You don't have to tell me, but I'm going to ask this: the most money you ever won?
The most. Well, I won a couple of big challenges years ago where the grand prize was $25,000. Which, at the time that was good, but I should have waited till now, like, won like the DraftKings $1 million or something. That would have been better.
Okay. So do you like playing in leagues like that where you don't know anybody, or do you like playing in leagues like home leagues?
Well, I've been in both. I've never been in like a home league with friends or family. Like, most people have done that. I just never have. But the two experts leagues I'm in, Labor and Tout Wars, that's kind of like a home league where I've been in it for several years. Lots of the guys are the same guys, so that's kind of like a home league. And we usually see each other in person for the draft, except for COVID.
Yeah, I've been in a couple different leagues. Like, I've been in leagues where it's just like some friends of mine, and then leagues like where it's like maybe not nobody I know. And I actually prefer playing in the leagues nobody knows, just because I want to test my knowledge, right? Like, I feel like my home league, we all kind of know each other and kind of maybe think a little bit of the same or a little different here and there. But I feel like when you're in a league where you don't know anybody, you get to kind of see your own views if it works or not. So, you know. As far as like just are you like sometimes in fantasy, like you got to separate your fandom from your, fantasy, right? Like, are you a fandom of like, any football team or baseball team?
Oh yeah, but I don't. I separate fantasy from the teams that I like.
What's your teams?
Well, the Red Sox for baseball.
Okay.
But but I don't take players on my fantasy team because they're on the Red Sox, and I don't avoid them because they're on the Yankees. Once in a while, it might be a conflict. Like if it's, I don't know, late in the season and the Red Sox are playing the Yankees and they're in contention, and I've got a pitcher on the Yankees, once in a while that would be like a little bit of a conflict, but not too often.
Okay. And what about football? You got a football team?
I guess I'm mostly Boston Patriots.
Okay.
Although right now there's not too much to root for there.
Hey, I don't want to hear that, Larry. You had 20 years to root for things.
Yeah.
I'm when it comes to fantasy, I tell it all fandom goes out the way. It's all about money.
Right.
So
people actually, when people say, what's your favorite team? Actually, my answer is my fantasy team.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a diehard Packers fan, but I mean, if I've had Bears on my teams, I was like, I hope he goes off even when he plays the Packers, as long as the Packers win the game, so like, or vice versa, in those ways. We got a couple questions from some comments real quick before we get out of here. Cross wants to know, what do you know any of the origins of like fantasy MMA leagues?
I don't. Now MMA, it is mentioned. I have a list of like every time I heard of like a different type of fantasy league, I would make a note. And in the book, I compiled a list where there's more than 50 different types of fantasy leagues I've heard about. And I said I'm sure there's more that I didn't even hear about, but I don't know how MMA started. I do know there's a sumo wrestling fantasy league, and I know that a lot of like the worldwide expansion happened from people visiting the U.S. Like a journalist from Italy was on vacation in the U.S. He saw a book about fantasy football, and he read it. Or, he's like, geez, I bet I could apply this to soccer. So he created a fantasy soccer game in Italy, which then later spread, to England and other places. And now, fantasy soccer is really big in Europe. It's really big in South America. Same thing happened with a guy from India. Harsh Jain was a student. He's from India. He was a student in England, and he heard about fantasy soccer, and he's like, geez, we need to do this in India for fantasy cricket. And he started a fantasy cricket company when he got back to India. So it's kind of like that. So I'm not sure. I don't know how MMA started, but somebody obviously got the idea from seeing other fantasy sports.
Yeah, it sounds like if there's a sport, they make a MMA or they make a fantasy league for it.
You can if it anything that has any kind of statistics, you can make it into a fantasy league.
And real quick, Bob wants to know, what's your opinion on daily fantasy? Do you think it accelerated the popularity of the game, or more the vast legalization of gambling?
I would say both. Because there's definitely, fantasy sports and daily fantasy sports is not gambling, but daily fantasy sports is kind of close to gambling. And now, with the laws that have been changed, legalizing it, DraftKings and FanDuel, they offer fantasy sports, and they also offer gambling. So it's a real connection there. In fact, the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, there's a chapter in the book about the Fantasy Sports Trade Association and how that all started and what they've done. And they've been involved in a lot of the legal issues, among other things. But about 5 years or so ago, they changed the name of it from the Fantasy Sports Trade Association to the Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association, because it now includes, betting operations, because there's such a connection between the two and a crossover.
Yeah. Do you gamble?
Daily fantasy sports really, though, it helped explode the popularity of fantasy sports, because a lot of people have an interest in fantasy sports, but the season long is too much for them. They don't want to commit 6 months for baseball or football or hockey or whatever. But daily, it's like, oh, okay, one day at a time, that I can handle.
Are you a gambler, Larry?
Not really. Used to be a little bit, but not really anymore.
I just feel like most people who play fantasy or some sort of sport are kind of link it to gambling as all at the same, or are good at both, maybe. Because they, if you kind of know a player's going to do well, you think he's going to do well, in gambling wise too. So I just feel like they kind of, like you said, they kind of collide together there. So. Larry, let the people know before we get out of here where they can find you and get the plug of the book in one more time.
It's on most booksellers' websites, paperback and ebook. Amazon has all the details about everything and lots of reviews on Amazon. It's called The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen. And
check out. Go ahead, Larry. Sorry.
You can find me on Twitter, Larry Schechter.
And all that is in the description of this episode, folks. Larry, I appreciate you joining me this evening. It's great to learn about the history of fantasy and everything else. So we got some, thanks, Mike. Support independent bookstores in this man. Appreciate it.
A lot of the independent bookstores have it.
We appreciate it, Larry. Thanks for joining me tonight. Folks, I'll be back Wednesday night for a new episode of Head Kicks and Haymakers at 8 o'clock Central, 9 Eastern. We got a special guest, so it just won't be myself and Bobby Blunts and Whit. We got a special guest coming on Wednesday night as well. So tune in for that, 8 o'clock Central, 9 Eastern, Wednesday right here. Other than that, Larry, I appreciate you joining us. Hopefully everybody gets Larry's book, learn some stuff, get involved in your fantasy football, fantasy baseball, have some fun. That's what fantasy is supposed to be. That's what life's supposed to be, folks. But we'll see you later, folks. Be a friend, tell a friend, like, subscribe, share. Thank you, Larry. This has been another great episode of the Bodkins Show. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for joining us, and until next time, let's talk sport, friends. Thanks for watching.